The good fairy Christina, who'd been at the christening, soon found out about the princess, and she rushed over to the king and queen's palace in her golden chariot. She was a very clever fairy, because she realized that if the princess woke up in 100 years' time and found herself alone, she'd be very frightened. So the fairy waved her magic wand and put all the servants in the palace and the king and queen to sleep as well. In just a few minutes, a large number of thorny bushes and trees with intertwining branches grew up around the palace, and it became impossible for anyone to get through. 100 years had passed, while the enchanted castle slept. Then, one day, a handsome young prince rode by. He noticed the towers of the palace sticking up above the bushes, and being a curious lad, he got off his horse to have a better look. The young prince saw a man riding by on a horse and shouted out to him, "Do you know who lives in those towers over there?" "You'll find witches and ghosts living there," replied the man, and then he rode off. The prince didn't take this answer very seriously, so he decided to ask a farmer who was walking by the same question. The farmer told him, "Many years ago, a beautiful young princess lived here with the king and queen, and it is said that she was put under a spell that would make her sleep for 100 years. I was told that she would only wake up when the most handsome prince in the land kissed her." When he heard this, the prince was so fascinated by the story that he rushed straight over to the tangled woods and tried to cut his way through with his sword. But there was no need for him to do this, because every time he moved forward, the trees made a path that let him pass through. When he entered the palace courtyard, he was amazed at what he saw. All the servants were asleep. Some had even fallen asleep standing up. The prince called out, "Hello? Anybody there?" But there was no reply. All the palace was absolutely quiet, except for the occasional sound of snoring. He walked past all the servants, thinking they might wake up, but none of them did. He even tickled a couple of them, but he got no response. Next, he came to the palace guard. They were all lined up in front of a grand staircase, with muskets on their shoulders, but even they were fast asleep. Even so, the prince was a little nervous of just walking past, so he went very close to the ear of the sergeant in charge and shouted as loud as he could, "Wake up!" But the sergeant just snored a little louder, so the prince carried on up the marble staircase. He kept on walking until he came to the grandest room in the palace. In the middle of this room was a magnificent four-poster bed with all the curtains drawn back. Lying on the bed was the most beautiful girl that the prince had ever seen. She was dressed in a magnificent gown, but like everyone else in the palace, she was fast asleep. The prince realized that this must be the princess, and she had been sleeping for 100 years. "Hello," he whispered. "I am the prince who's come to break your spell." And then he knelt beside the bed and kissed the princess very gently. This was the very moment at which the wicked fairy's spell was broken and the princess awoke. When she saw the prince kneeling at her bedside, she looked straight into his deep blue eyes and said, "I have waited a long time for you, my prince." The prince was charmed by these words, and he quickly told the princess that he had loved her as soon as he first saw her. At the very same moment that the princess had woken up, everyone else in the palace had also been woken from their deep sleep. The king and queen, all their servants, the palace guards and the courtiers started busily about their business. They were all delighted because they saw that their beautiful young princess had woken from her 100-year sleep, and it was clear that she was very happy with the handsome prince. But those of them who were not in love were very hungry indeed. So a huge celebration banquet was prepared, and they all sat down in the grand hall to a hearty meal, including the happy young prince and princess. While they were eating this grand meal, all the thorny bushes and trees with intertwining branches that had surrounded the palace for 100 years disappeared. The prince took the beautiful princess home to his palace and introduced her to his parents, the king and queen. They were very happy that the two were so deeply in love, and the very next day the handsome prince and the beautiful princess were married at a grand ceremony. After the wedding ceremony, everybody waved goodbye to the prince and princess as they set off to a faraway land for their honeymoon.